was flipping the channels last week to try desperately to get some news about the bombings of the Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon. It was a fruitless search on the news stations. Instead, I was treated to breathless coverage of Paris Hilton's exploits. I think she's a perfect poster child for an empire in decline. She's an utterly vacuous parasite, perhaps the singularly least interesting specimen of our species. Which is why it is so important for us to have outlets of genuine news and journalism. It is so rare for us to have somebody on our side reach the bestseller list in the New York Times. This book sold out this weekend here at Haymarket, but if you put yourself on the list, if you want to buy it here today, we will send it to you for free. We are getting more copies. We want as many people as possible to read Jeremy Scahill's book. And unlike Jon Stewart, who was, in my opinion, quite snide when Jeremy went on his show, on The Daily Show, he seemed to think that, somehow a shadow army of 130,000 was no big deal. Although Jeremy did tell me last night that some 17,000 people wrote into The Daily Show complaining about how horrific he was treated. Jeremy Scahill.
Yeah, Mr. Stewart. I don't want to talk about that right now.
17,001.
I did write a book about Blackwater, but I'm not going to focus on Blackwater tonight. I want to talk about some of the bigger picture. I think we have a real crisis in this country that seldom gets recognized, and that is that we have allowed the powerful, the rich, the Democrats, the Republican Cheech and Chong machine to define, I stole that from Immortal Technique. We have allowed for too long the rich and the powerful to define the political context through which we view the world. We need to remove 9/11 from our memories for a moment and look at a perfect trajectory of mass slaughter in Iraq that extends back many decades and extends to both the Democratic and Republican regimes that have ruled this country. You see, the U.S. policy in Iraq has been consistent. It's been consistently anti-Iraqi. From the time when they supported the rise of the Ba'ath Party and the Central Intelligence Agency provided Ba'ath Party assassins with lists of leftists in Iraq so that they could be hunted down and killed, to the brutal regime of Saddam Hussein of the 1980s. When he was at his most brutal was when he was shaking Donald Rumsfeld's hand in Baghdad. To the 1990s, where the George H.W. Bush administration systematically bombed the civilian infrastructure of Iraq, causing the country to fall into a spiral of chaos and bloodshed and carnage. And then the Clinton administration picked up from where the Bush administration left off and implemented the most brutal regime of economic sanctions in history. That was the weapon of mass destruction in Iraq of the 1990s. I started going to Iraq in 1998 when Bill Clinton was in power. And I don't know how many Americans are aware of this, but it was Bill Clinton who initiated the longest sustained bombing campaign since Vietnam under the guise of the so-called no-fly zones. They said, we're going to protect the Kurds in the north and the Shiites in the south. Some strange protection, dropping bombs on Kurds and Shiites and saying you're out there to defend their human rights. So we've seen this consistent bipartisan policy, and the fact of the matter is there didn't need to be any 9/11 to rampage Iraq. Iraq was being rampaged before there was a 9/11. And we know that it's an outright lie that Iraq had any connection whatsoever to 9/11. In fact, the interesting thing that happened is that the Democrats in 2002, we have to remember this, were in control of the U.S. Senate at a time when this country was debating the Iraq policy of the Bush administration. And Joe Biden was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And I was sitting here in Chicago at the office of Kathy Kelly in the Voices in the Wilderness campaign. And I was sitting with Hans von Spanek, who was the former head of the United Nations in Iraq, who resigned in protest of the U.S. policy in Iraq. He followed suit after Dennis Halliday had resigned that same post. And Hans von Spanek was a 32-year veteran of the United Nations, a deputy Secretary General of the UN. He had just gotten back in August of 2002 from the north of Iraq, where he met with the al-Qaeda presence in the north of Iraq, in the area controlled by the U.S.-backed Kurdish political parties. He met with the Ansar al-Islam guerrillas, and he talked with them about how they were fighting Saddam's forces. Saddam's forces were regularly engaged in battles against Ansar al-Islam, which was operating from the safety of a U.S.-controlled part of Iraq. If there was a connection between Iraq and al-Qaeda, it was the United States government. And we sat there in that office that day and we called repeatedly to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when Biden was chairing these hearings, and they had one pro-war person after another pro-war person. The parameter of the debate was set at, do we bomb the hell out of Iraq or do we invade the country? And we said, we have a former Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, the former head of the UN program in Iraq. He's just got back from meeting with the al-Qaeda presence in the north of Iraq, and we want to send him out there to testify, and they would not have Hans von Spanek go there. And that was Joe Biden and the Democratic Party in charge of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And now we see the Bush administration rampaging this country once again, but it's an error to simply end the sentence with the blame on the Bush administration's shoulders, because the fact of the matter is this: Bush is less responsible right now for the continuing carnage and slaughter in Iraq than the Democrats in Congress. Representative Jack Murtha, who's often portrayed as being anti-war, which is a total farce. That man is not anti-war. Representative Jack Murtha said a couple of weeks ago, we need to bring accountability to an unaccountable war. No, Representative Murtha, we need to bring an end to an unaccountable war. We have seen now well over 700,000 Iraqis that have died who otherwise wouldn't have if there wasn't an occupation since March of 2003. And you add to that the 1 million plus who were killed during the years of the economic sanctions and the humanitarian bombings in the no-fly zones, and you have one of the greatest mass slaughters in history. And the fact of the matter is right now that the Democrats hide behind this false rhetoric of we support the troops, we don't want to undercut the troops. Barack Obama, we don't want to play chicken with the troops. Well, let's talk about their support for the troops. I met Eli Wright, who's in the front row here from IAVW, and I met him out in Colorado the day that he started speaking out against the war publicly on the radio. And Eli and I talked, and he was describing to me how he was in Ramadi, which at the time was one of the most volatile areas in Anbar province in Iraq. And he said that he hadn't been in an armored vehicle, his Jeep, he was taking it and bolting steel to it, and that they were putting sandbags to try to protect themselves against improvised explosive devices. Those soldiers are running around with Vietnam-era flak jackets. Some of their parents are back home trying to raise money to get them real body armor. And then the Blackwater mercenaries whiz by, and they've got better armor, better equipment. They're the rock stars, the superheroes of Iraq. What do they mean, support the troops, when you have Blackwater mercenaries being paid more money than the Secretary of Defense of the United States to be in the same war zone as these kids right here? Who's supporting the troops? What troops? The Blackwater troops, the Dying Corps troops, the Armor Group troops, the 181 mercenary companies currently operating in Iraq? There's no coalition of willing nations in Iraq. There's a coalition of billing corporations. And what this coalition of the billing has enabled the Bush administration to do is you keep a draft off the table in the United States. And what you do is you go into countries that the United States has systematically destabilized, targeted economically, militarily, with the terrorism of neoliberal economic policy and the iron fist of overt militarism and covert actions. And you go into those countries, places like Chile, Colombia, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nepal, the Philippines, and you recruit up their soldiers. You put ads in papers and you say, former commandos from Pinochet's military, come and join our force in Iraq. And so what you do is you replace any semblance of diplomacy with your coalition of the billing who goes in and hires up the brutal thug forces from countries destabilized by the United States, and you send them over to kill the poor of Iraq. And I don't want to hear a single person in this country complain about the resistance in Iraq, because the fact of the matter is, you don't choose the resistance to the occupation you should have stopped in the first place. We hear the Bush administration demonizing Muqtada al-Sadr. And they say, Muqtada al-Sadr, we have to disarm his militia. No, you need to disarm the Blackwater militia, because Muqtada al-Sadr's people are Iraqis. They're not working for a neo-crusader named Eric Prince who believes the Bible's the only infallible word of God and has his heavily armed forces deployed in Iraq right now. I love those bumper stickers that I still continue to see. Don't blame me, I voted for Kerry. I blame you because you voted for Kerry. I want to wrap up by saying that what we have seen unfold in Iraq right now was entirely predictable. I went in and out of Iraq over the course of more than 5 years, and I met with Tariq Aziz many times, who was the deputy prime minister of Iraq, and the last time I met with him was in Baghdad in February of 2003. And never in any of my previous interviews with Tariq Aziz, who's now being forced to dig a hole in the ground as his bathroom. He's being held a prisoner right now, we believe, at the Baghdad airport. But Tariq Aziz had never acknowledged to me that the Ba'ath Party could be removed, that Saddam Hussein could be overthrown, but on this meeting he did. He said the United States is the most powerful empire in history. It could take down our government. It can destroy the Ba'ath Party. But let me tell you something. You, if you do that, will unleash a Pandora's box that you will never be able to close. And what we have seen, Tariq Aziz said, is the United States wage a systematic war against Arab nationalism. And what they were saying is that the only response to the rise of religious fundamentalism is Arab nationalism in this region. And so by destroying Iraq, which was the most stable secular country in that region, they set off a chain reaction that now we're seeing the consequences of. And it's not the US soldiers that are paying the highest price, it's the Iraqi civilians who are paying the highest price. And the height of hubris is when we hear Americans say, if we withdraw, there will be so much bloodshed. If we withdraw, there will be so much bloodshed. And they talk about there will be a civil war. Well, we have to remember right now that the bloodshed, every bit of it, whether it's an Iraqi suicide bomber blowing up another Iraqi, is the responsibility of the United States government, which made a decision to invade and occupy that country. I want to say what a tremendous honor it has been to meet the veterans who are at this conference. What stark contrast exists between these courageous and brave heroes and those pro-war veterans who ran on the Democratic ticket in the last election. What an absolute joke that is. They say, well, we need people with military experience to run for Congress. Yes, we do, and they're all sitting in the front row right here. This conference has been one of the most uplifting experiences I have had since this invasion and occupation began. I have seen and talked with so many incredibly impressive young leaders. I think that we are seeing the rise or the re-rise of an incredibly vibrant anti-war movement in this country. I take great hope from the fact that Dar Jamail, the great unembedded reporter who so often puts his life on the line, has been here and sharing his firsthand experiences with us, and he remembers that in war the most powerful weapon is the truth. And Dar Jamail, it's an honor to have you here. And I love the fact that we have people like Dave Zirin, who always remind us that if we allow the powerful to take away our smile, our ability to laugh, then that's their true victory. And I also want to say, and this is a departure from discussion on the Iraq, that it's an honor to be in the presence of so many people who had the will to survive the prison industrial complex in this country and are so because you know what needs to happen? The United States needs to get all of its troops, all of its mercenaries out of Iraq and pay reparations, and they need to pay reparations to Yusuf Islam as well. And the last thing I'll say is that I think we all have to remember something that actually Dan Berrigan, the radical Catholic priest, said about Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic worker movement. He said she lived as though the truth were true. And so whenever we feel like we're a small group of people, we have to remember that the world is on our side. We keep our humanity. We keep ourselves human beings by being resistors, by engaging in the struggle, by never allowing those in power to dictate who's a resistor, who's not a resistor. Victory is relative when you listen to the powerful. But we have a victory in our midst because the entire world is on our side. And so I say we call for an end to the death penalty in this country and the collective death penalty being meted out on the rest of the world by this criminal government.